Hello everyone, my name is Jada Lugo. I'm the manager of outreach programs at the Florida Holocaust Museum. The Holocaust was the systematic, state-sponsored persecution and murder of 6 million Jews by the Nazi regime and their allies and collaborators between the years 1933 and 1945. Today, January 27th, is International Holocaust Remembrance Day, which marks the liberation of the killing center concentration camp Auschwitz in Poland by the Soviet Army. The mission of the Florida Holocaust Museum is to honor the memory of millions of innocent men, women, and children who suffered or died in the Holocaust. The mission as part of the mission of the Florida Holocaust Museum to do this, we are also dedicated to teaching the members of all races and cultures the inherent worth and dignity of human life in order to prevent future genocides. The Florida Holocaust Museum was founded by Walter and Edie Lowenberg, who were Holocaust survivors in 1992. It is still located in St. Petersburg, Florida today, downtown St. Petersburg. Please come visit us. And the Florida Holocaust Museum is one of only 3 Holocaust museums in the US that is accredited by the American Alliance of Museums. It is also the only Holocaust museum in Florida that provides Holocaust education across the state. And if you want to learn more about our education initiatives, please come visit us outside of the theater today. Anyone whose life was impacted by the Holocaust is a survivor. And one of the ways in which the Florida Holocaust Museum continues its mission to honor the memory of the Holocaust victims is through its program Across Generations, Conversations with Holocaust Survivors and Their Descendants. It is incredibly important for the testimonies of survivors to be passed down and preserved for generations to come, so thank you for coming here today. When someone hears a survivor's testimony, they become a witness to a witness of the Holocaust. The Holocaust began over 90 years ago, and many Holocaust survivors have now passed, and there are a few who remain alive today to share their testimonies with the world. But there are descendants of Holocaust survivors who have taken on the responsibility of sharing their family stories and the multi-generational effects of the Holocaust, and Ruth Wade is one of these descendants. Ruth Wade is a docent and a second-generation speaker at the Florida Holocaust Museum, and she shares the story of her father, Sidney Finkel, who survived the Holocaust as a child. Without further ado, please welcome Ruth Wade.
Thank you. It is it's such an honor to be here today and to carry on the legacy of my father's story. My father, his name is Sidney Finkel, but his name was Sevik when he was little. And this is a photograph of him on the left in August of 1945, just after the war, getting on a transport, on an RAF bomber plane actually, to Windermere, England. If anyone's familiar with the Windermere Children, it's a wonderful movie on PBS. My dad's it's not him in that movie, but it's really his story of after the war to immediately after the war. But we'll talk about that in a little bit. And then on the right is my dad from a few years ago. He just turned 92. He lives in Tucson, Arizona, and he still he still speaks to students today. This is some pictures of him talking. And he loves kids and loves telling a story to kids, and he really believes that by sharing his story and by children and adults to reading his book, he can really change the world and really promote what happens when, keeping what happens when you are not tolerant of other people. And as Jada said, the systematic murder of 6 million Jews and anti-Semitism, but really the dehumanization of anybody in any culture, anywhere. When I'm talking to the kids at the museum, I talk a lot about choices that get made. And there's really kind of 3 things I like to say that how survivors survived. One is just random luck. They just got lucky. And secondly, there's something, maybe some skills that they've learned to help them survive. And then the third is the help from other people, and to really try to focus on people being upstanders and the choices that people can make, whether it's very small and just helping someone's morale by smiling at them or not turning away, to systematically helping them. And my dad was very fortunate to encounter all three of those things, so that he was able to survive. So when we tell the story of Sevek, we don't tell the story of a 92-year-old man. We tell the story of an 8-year-old who was the youngest of 5 children and spoiled rotten. His family loved him. He adored his father adored him. And he had this really ordinary kind of life up until the age of 8 when the Germans invaded Poland. And from that time on, it's really a story of dehumanization. You'll hear his story. I'm going to play a short video too. You'll see and get to kind of meet him. But his story is one of witnessing brutality, murder, family murder, all kinds of horrendous things, to the point where by the end of the war, towards the end of the war, he becomes so dehumanized, he feels like he's an animal. And so I'm gonna go to the next slide, which is going to show a movie that was produced by Arizona Public Media. They were showing the U.S. and the Holocaust, the Ken Burns special, and they interviewed many of the survivors in the Tucson community. And they did a short and a long, but the short was like an introduction to the Ken Burns special in Tucson, or in Arizona. And so that's what I'm going to share with you today. We'll give it a moment to sink in. It's a lot to pack into 10, 11 minutes. They did such an amazing job. I like to ask the kids, who I'm really trying to, help understand that there are choices that they can make and become upstanders, and try to think about, what are some of the things that you saw in that video where there were choices made. And I just gave a talk a couple days ago, and one of the kids said his mom made a choice to, many of us, there's mothers in the room probably, who would make that same choice. You don't even think about it, but to cover him up with his body. But this is like one of the last memories he has of his mother, of this way that she loved him. We talk about Rania, his sister, who is in this. This is her here on the right. She was 20 years older. She was the oldest of the siblings. And, there was a Polish family who made a choice to save her, and get her to the Catholic hospital, which, was amazing, because anybody who was making those kinds of righteous choices was risking their own life and the lives of their own families. So for her to, for that family to do that was a big deal. And then, of course, there was the choice that someone made to inform on them, so that the baby was thrown out the window. And it's also a really important story in my dad's life, because he experienced so much pain from when he found out about this. His family actually kept it from him for a couple weeks. So they were living in the ghetto. He was he was probably 9 or 10. And he just sobbed and sobbed and sobbed. He spent so much emotional energy crying, and at some point he just stopped, and he said, I need to numb probably not consciously, but, I'm not going to love anymore, because I'm just going to get hurt. So, numbing of the emotions was something that, lasted a long time. It's not something you can just, turn back on again as a young kid, when he became an adult. But it served him well, in a sense, to survive what he had to survive in the next few years. Staying behind, I want to talk about in the middle is his brother Izzy. Izzy was 17 years older than him, and my father adored him. He was an officer in the Polish army, and he admired, the uniform and the gun, and he just, thought Izzy was, a hero to him. And Izzy was a hero for my father. He made so many great choices to save my dad. He was shot, and he thought he was going to die, and he has his own amazing story. But he was able to come back and live in the ghetto. But he was able to leave the ghetto and go back and forth because he was considered a casualty of war, and he can get medical attention, even though he was a Jew. So it was very unusual. But he could go in and out of the ghettos, and so he was able to smuggle some food into the ghetto. And then when it came to those work permits, when they were getting ready for the selection, he was able to go to people he knew outside of the ghetto and get work permits for the family. And he said, and he also survived. So he said in his testimonial that he thought they were his friends, but he didn't think they were because they charged him money. They made him pay for those work permits. They didn't just give them to him. He felt if they were my friends, they would have given them to me. And I don't always tell that part to the kids. It's like one of those complicated choices, But still, if they hadn't done that, hadn't been willing, then our family would not have survived. My grandfather, his name was Labe. We have no pictures of him. He owned a lumber mill. So the family was pretty, did have some money, but they were comfortable. And he was able to sell to his partner. He had a non-Jewish partner, and he was able to sell the business. So they did have a little bit of money when they were living in the ghetto so that they could, get by and have food. So my dad will tell you that he doesn't remember ever being hungry, although there were many people starving. And he was a kid, kind of rambunctious, kind of fun-loving, adventurous kid, and so he kind of saw, day to day as being an adventure. He stopped going to school. There was no more school to go to. He had a first grade education. He was a little wild. Things happened to him like he'd get into a fight. He got into a fight with somebody one time because he wanted to help unload a truck of potatoes, and the person who was unloading threw a sack of potatoes at him, and he thought, I'm the coolest. I'm special because of what he'd always been told. And he started to get into a fight with this other person, and there was a Nazi standing nearby who saw this, so came over, kind of grabs Sevek by the scruff of his neck and pulls out his revolver and puts it to his head, Sevek's head, my dad's head, and says, "See this bullet? It's going to go in your head." And my dad thought he was going to die. And one of the Jewish elders who was on the council that helped the Nazis run the ghetto happened to see this and came over and said something and intervened so that Sevek was sent home. And so he survived. And, so kind of random that the man was there and saw this. Kind of an interesting choice that this elder decided to intervene because there could have been bad consequences for him. And interesting choice, actually, that this Nazi made to put his gun down and not shoot Sevek because people got randomly shot and beaten all the time in the ghetto. There were no laws. There were no rules about what you could and couldn't do if you were a Nazi. On the far left is his mother, Figa, and then with my Aunt Rachel. And so, you heard in the video that Figa ended up in Treblinka. And if you come to the museum and you see the boxcar there, the cattle car, the tracks that the cattle car's on are actually from the killing center of Treblinka. And Treblinka was a place where people went that, only a handful of people survived because it was basically just a killing center. But Aunt Rachel was the person who, the few times that Sevek did get in trouble, he could run to Aunt Rachel's house, and she would, protect him, give him some cookies, and say, you leave Savick alone. He's so cute. So he has very fond memories of his Aunt Rachel. Okay. I don't know where I'm supposed to aim. Help! Thank you, Abby. I don't know why it's not going.
When your father got in the fight,
Yes.
fighting another Jewish person? Who was he fighting?
Yeah, it probably was. It was another, slave laborer who was helping unload the truck. Yeah. And that's a great, thank you. Yeah, I mean, while we're waiting, if there's any questions that you have so far about, life in the ghetto, his family was in the ghetto for 3 years. He lived in the town of Pietrków Trybunalski. And then one of my favorite things about talking to the kids is I put the alliteration up, and I'm like, who's brave enough to try and say the name? And some poor soul, always volunteers, and it doesn't exactly roll off the tongue. Pietrków Trybunalski. I had to say it a lot. He had another incident too, where he was gotten into trouble, and the chapter in my book is called "Not Made of Glass" because of this incident. He was getting beaten by the Nazi for something. And he was crying and begging and moaning, and the more he did that, the more sadistic the Nazi became, until finally little Savick said, my ass isn't made of glass, and go ahead and beat me. So he said, he was really, really sore from that, but for a few days he was like a hero in the ghetto. People heard about him, and it was like, thank you. So there's Pietrków Trybunalski ghetto, and this was a map of the boundary. And then this is a picture of Sulejo, which is the town that they ran to. They ran away from Pietrków to get away from the bombing, but then Sulejo actually got bombed. Yeah, so the day came where selection, and I talked to you about the permits a little bit, and Izzy and his mother, and you heard in the video. So Savick had a sister named Lola, who was about 10 years older than him, and she also survived. And he called her the mean Lola. She was the one who did try to get him in trouble at the dinner table. I saw Savick in the marketplace today, and he wasn't wearing shoes, And he'd stick his tongue out at her, and the family would say, Lola, leave him alone. And Lola and his sister Franja were holding hands. They were able to stay in the ghetto when the selection happened to go to Treblinka. Of course, they didn't know they were going to Treblinka. They were told they were being resettled to another camp that was going to have better conditions and blah, blah, blah. And they knew it wasn't good. They had no idea that they were going to a killing center. So Franja really wanted to be with her mother, and she was holding, Lola was holding her hand, and Lola couldn't hold on any longer, and Franja tore herself away looking for her mother. So that's how she ended up going to Treblinka. And Lola was haunted by this. She never talked about the war, but apparently she did tell my dad this one story, because it was just, it impacted her so much. And then even as a kid, when I was growing up, they never got along. Even after everything. I mean, I think they loved each other, but they never got along. We would go to dinner at Lola's house, and inevitably some big fight would break out, and we would end up leaving. Family, right? This is the cattle car from the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. Of course, there is the one that you can see for yourself, and live and up close at the museum. And I encourage you all to do that if you haven't. This is here because when my dad talks about the trains and he talks about the cattle car, I mean, just think of the word cattle car. I mean, talk about dehumanization. It's not a people car. It's a cattle car. And this was kind of the line for him between adventure and terror. When he had to get on this cattle car to Buchenwald, of course he didn't know where he was going, but when he had to get on this cattle car, and he was separated from his family for the first time, that's when it became a nightmare for him. And when he started telling his story, actually was the year that the museum opened, and we as a family went to the museum in Washington, D.C., and it was a very interesting experience, as we're going through, he was like being like a docent, like when I'm a docent with the kids, very unemotional, he was being very civic, no emotion. And he's showing us on this glass plate where it's etched the town Piotr Trzebanowski, which I heard for the first time. And, he's showing us this and that and telling stories. And then you had to cross through the cattle car to get from one part of the museum to the other. I don't know if it's still like that or not. But, and he stepped on that car and he just lost it. And he just started sobbing. And so, we all put our arms around him and got him off the car, and he calmed down. And one of the gifts that I talk about of my dad and his resilience is then, after the whole experience at the museum, we sat outside on the lawn, and he wanted to process. He's like, I want to talk. I want to know how you all were feeling in there, and I want to tell you how I was feeling in there. And it was like, it was amazing. But that moment in time, I like to share that because it just get across like how important that cattle car is, that experience in terms of the dehumanization and the nightmare of this for the 6 million Jews or anybody who went through that. And then there's Buchenwald, where he becomes a number. They only tattooed in Auschwitz, so he didn't have a tattoo. But he had a number. He was no longer Sevik or Shaya or Sidney. He was 25381. But something very interesting about Buchenwald, some really interesting things happened here. One, Buchenwald didn't start as a Jewish concentration camp. And it wasn't a death camp, although many people died and were killed there. Starvation, overwork, exhaustion, brutality. But it was actually began as a prisoner of war camp, a political prisoner camp, and a criminal camp. If you were a criminal, if you were, if you didn't swear the oath to Hitler, if you were considered an enemy, you might have gone to Buchenwald. And so some of those political prisoners were still there. Also communists, like you said, there were quite a few Russian prisoners there. If you were a communist, you were there. There was a group that saw all these kids coming in and made a decision to start an underground, and they wanted to save as many children as they could. There's actually a movie about it called Kinderblock 66. They put these kids, now the kids didn't know, my dad didn't know this for many years, and he started working with a historian who was uncovering what actually was going on. And then he could piece together his memories with, what the historian had learned. So they put the kids into this place called the Little Camp. And it was a barracks that was in the most destitute, disease-ridden, horrible area of Buchenwald. And I as the kids, why would they do that? If you're trying to save children, why are you putting them into this section? And I don't know if anyone has any thoughts about that. It was the area where the Nazis didn't want to go. Yes, that's right. And so they pretty much stayed away from that area and gave the guard, or not the guards, the political prisoners who were helping them, gave them much more leeway. And so the kids had easier work assignments, and maybe a little bit more food. Like my dad and his friend had a job and working in the kitchen until they got caught smuggling food, because he was my dad, and he was a risk taker. But he had to go work in the quarry for a little bit, but then he was saved from that. Anyway, so this underground was a systematic choice. I mean, if these people had been found out, then, I don't know what, they could have been easily executed. And so they made that choice. I want to go back for a second too, talk a little bit more about Izzy. He, when they were in the selection line for Treblinka, Sevek was too young to stay in the camp. He was supposed to get on that train, but his dad and his brother said, "Hide behind me," and so he hid behind them, and he was seen, and the guard said, "I see him," and Izzy stepped out of line and gave him some kind of bribe, which worked, obviously. But I think about that, and like the risk that Izzy took, could have easily said, "Okay, now you're going on that train too. All of you are." And he took this tremendous risk to save my father. And you'll see later on when I have one son, his name is Ike. His name is Isaac, and in the Jewish tradition, we often name our children in memory of a family member, and I just wanted to honor Isaac, or my Uncle Izzy, for the role he played in saving my father's life. So here he is in Buchenwald now, and he mentioned in the video that he saw his father for the last time, and he wasn't very receptive to seeing him, and this was the man he adored. So that was also a really important thing. So I actually would like to, I'm going to read to you. Uh-oh, I lost my place. The little section about his dad. Uh-oh. I usually have it marked right here. Here it is. I have an indelible memory of my last meeting with my father. He came across me as I was standing with my friends in the compound. My father cried with joy when he saw me. He hugged me as tears ran down his cheeks. He had lost a lot of weight, and he looked very weak and emaciated. He took a piece of bread from the knapsack from his shoulder, and he handed it to me. The gesture of the bread showed his great love for me, since these were the only provisions he had for his transport out of Buchenwald. I took the bread, but I felt agitated and uncomfortable. Here, standing before me, was the one person in the world that I loved more than any other, and yet I was incapable of feeling affection. I bore no resemblance to the son that he knew. Sevek, the fun-loving, affectionate, boyish kid, was dead. I now was more like an animal with instincts only for survival. Likely he was being sent to his death. I am unsure under what conditions we met, and yet I was silent. I turned my back on my own father without giving him the slightest bit of encouragement or acknowledgement. Who was I? What kind of an animal had I become in the camps? This encounter was so powerful that it stayed with me for the rest of my life. Guilt plagued me and caused me to believe that I had betrayed my father. I left my father standing alone and walked back to my block to be with the young people. Old people had no right to live. They were taking resources from the young, I thought to myself. My God, I was beginning to think just like the Nazis. Yeah, so dehumanization completed. Yes?
This picture, are those Allied soldiers on the left?
I don't know.
Okay,
They might be.
looks like it.
It might be, and then, that's my dad should have been there, but instead, like he said in the video, like the day later, yeah, timing. In 2012, we took a trip to Buchenwald, me and my brother and my dad and his wife, and it was an amazing trip. They had an annual commemoration. They invited survivors to come back, and this on the right here is him walking in and out of the gate. I have video of it too, because he could, locked in, right? On the left is the area where the little camp stood. And I told you he liked to process things, and he was really good about his own healing processes. And he took us to this place, and he had us all put our arms around each other. And he spoke to his father's spirit. And he said, Dad, Dad, I said, please forgive me. I am so sorry for walking away from you, for what I did. I felt terrible. I know that you're up there. I know that you love me. And I know you understand. You'd be so proud of your grandchildren and the life that we're leading. And I just want to say that I love you. And he said, and that really helped him a lot. It was just a really special, special time. When he was, after his death march, he ended up back in Weimar, and then they got on these cattle cars. And this is the actual train he was on. I don't think he was on this particular car, but we haven't been able to find his face if he was. But this is the train he was on that ended up in Theresienstadt for 3 weeks. And he got, timing-wise, the camp was liberated as they arrived, and he had typhus, and he was able to get help. And he, like you said, in the infirmary, he, was getting better. And here's Sevik, his name being called in, and miraculously, it's his brother Izzy. Once again, there's Izzy to the rescue. And Izzy had made some contacts with a group that was taking children to Windermere, England. And so he was able to, England agreed to take in 1,000 children under the age of 16 and then a few chaperones. They weren't going to give you any money for them. No funds were available, but they said, okay, we'll give you the bombers to bring them over, and we'll allow you to have visas for a certain amount of time. And then the organizers, the Jewish community, pulled their money together and organized for them to be there to the Lake District of England, on the left there, in August of 1945. So for like three to 6 months, these kids, he was part of the first transit of 300 kids who went to Windermere. And here he is, he's 13, no education. He has an education, not a formal academic education. He has to learn how to be human again. This is all these kids, and if you ever have a chance to see that movie, The Windermere Children, it really shows you, how they had to become human again. He's used to, doesn't know how to sit at a table, doesn't know how to behave. He just only knows how to fight and scrap for, to survive. So he has to, rehumanize. And he was there for about 3 months. And the top picture is him getting on that bomber again. And then on the right, he gets sent to, so they couldn't go back to Poland. He actually, Aunt Rachel survived the war, actually went back to Piotrków, and she was murdered when she went back. Yeah, a lot of Jews were. They couldn't go home because the people of the town were afraid they're going to take their homes back. They're going to take their property back. A lot of what the Nazis were doing, a lot of Hitler's agenda was about wealth. He didn't just murder the Jews. He stole anything and everything that they had. And the Poles, followed suit. There were many, Poles were also victims, and there were many, many righteous Poles who did many things to save people's lives. But the reality was that many resented the Jews and didn't want them back. They couldn't go back. So he didn't have a place to go, so he was sort of under the auspices of the Central Committee, the Jewish Central Committee in England. He ended up in a boarding house school in Bunce Court, called Bunce Court in Kent. And that's where he really was, found people who really championed him, who really wanted to love him, were willing to, deal with his, outbursts and rage and everything, and just love him and hold him and help him. He learned how to play the piano there, and that played a, nice role, like, for him in healing and his music, and music was good for him. So he started to get better. And in 1951, he decided to come to the U.S. His sister Lola was in the U.S. He had an uncle in the U.S. who had come before the war and was able to sponsor him. But just actually a few years ago, my cousin Izzy stayed in England and raised his family there, and his daughter Anita sent me this packet of documents. Every time he needed a pair of socks. Anytime you just didn't realize how much he struggled even after the war because he had no money. He was basically a ward of the state. The middle picture is my son Ike, and that was his wedding about a year ago. And I was pregnant with Ike. When I first found my dad's story. He never talked about his story when I was growing up. But what I'm going to do is that's sort of the finish to it. The best thing survivors do is say, kind of, screw you, Hitler, let's have a family. Yeah, and that's his 90th birthday. But I think what I'll do, especially since it's a small group, is I'll go out to my table. I do have some books available for purchase, my dad's book and my book. And I'd be happy to answer questions out there, and that might be an easier way to do this. Thank you so much.